Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Scrutiny Management Committee hearing with the Policy and Resources Committee. And today we're going to be focusing primarily on the Capital Portfolio Review, which is due to be debated next week, and together with other members in the committee's mandate. I'm Deputy Yvonne Burford, and with me today is Deputy Simon Fairclough, Deputy Gavin St Pierre, and Mr Mark Huntington, who's the Principal Officer of Scrutiny. Following this session, we'll decide if any further action is needed, and there will be a transcript published on the Scrutiny website in due course. Could people please be aware that this session is being live streamed? We'll take a short comfort break at around 11 o'clock for 5 minutes, so if you please ensure your phones are set to silent now. We're pleased to welcome all 5 members of the Policy and Resources Committee today. However, we've got a great deal to get through, so we would really appreciate it if perhaps where possible, just perhaps one member answers questions and keep answers as concise as you reasonably can so that we can finish on time. So I could just now ask you please to introduce yourself, and we'll start down this end with Deputy Gollop.
Deputy Gollop, Member of Policy and Resources, and interested in topics like employment and the parishes.
Thank you.
Deputy Bob Murray.
Okay.
Deputy Jonathan Letok, Lead for External Relations and Constitutional Affairs.
Deputy Lyndon Trott, President of the Policy and Resources Committee.
Hi, Heidi Salisbury, Vice President.
Bowley Smiley, Chief Exec and Head of the Public Service.
Beth Ann Haynes, Chief Resources Officer.
Thank you very much. Right, well, straight into the questions. What do P&R hope to achieve by the debate on the major projects portfolio review?
I think that probably falls to me, but I want to make a couple of opening remarks, notwithstanding you've asked us to be brief. We think SMC hearings are excellent, and we're all very pleased to be here, which is why we're all here. But we've had some fantastic Moneyval news this morning, which sends out a very strong message that this jurisdiction is open for business. And that's an enormous relief, as you might imagine. And we are very strongly have the belief as a committee that we must and will continue to provide continuity, resilience and reliability. Now, a key part of the portfolio review is to bring into emphasis that although the agreed tax reform will stabilise our financial position, it's not sufficient to replenish depleted reserves. And that's something that it's important we mustn't lose sight of. And we're also hoping that what will come out of this important hearing this morning is a strong message to both prospective deputies and to voters that they need to do their homework, because these issues are far more complex than we might believe. And in many respects, the Funding and Development Plan Green Paper is no exception. Because what it does is it shows us that we've got a long list of genuinely priority capital developments, and we haven't got enough money to fund them. So we have got to get ourselves into a fiscal position where we have a much more realistic sort of funding programme going forward. Now, we believe that it's important to have a green paper, primarily to ensure that the community understands the issues, and in particular, prospective candidates understand the issues. I think whilst most members of the states understand them, prospective candidates need to be extended the same courtesy. So it really is important that this matter is debated so that the entire community understands the severity of the issues. The relevant papers will come back before this committee and next for them to make specific details on specific projects. Nothing is pressing right now. For instance, on Alderney Airport, we're not at this stage aware of the final figures. That will come in the passage of time. So there's no decisions for the states to make right now, but lots for them to make in the future. Okay. That's the importance of the Green Paper.
Okay, and in the, I think you're right that the states are very aware at the end of this term of the requirement for more funding in order for us to meet commitments. But in the policy letter, you've not sought to propose further revenue-raising measures, as you say that businesses and households have made plans based on the 2025 budget, which is the rationale that you give. But however, we know that new revenue-raising measures take time to put in place and would be unlikely to be bringing in an income stream until next year. So by not proposing them, is the committee unnecessarily exacerbating the financial position of the states?
Well, we're fortunate enough to have Beth Ann with us, whose department head up on these issues. And within the Green Paper, there is a section that deals with this particular issue of why we haven't sought to bring forward measures at this time. Beth Ann, are you comfortable sort of elaborating on what those might be?
Yes, so I mean clearly the 2025 budget is set, and the committee felt it wasn't of benefit to revisit some of the rates and etc. agreed for this year. In terms of measures for future years that have already been considered by the states and are being investigated, there is already a work stream underway looking at motoring taxation. Right. There is already a work stream underway looking at some kind of visitor levy, I thought of a third one, but I can't remember it now.
Okay,
so I think these work streams
are
already in train
okay.
and will be brought to the states in due course.
Okay.
The committee didn't feel that now was the right time to bring them.
But there's another point. I mean, the budget, and the paper says this, it takes months and months to finalise. It requires extensive consultation with our community and those who are affected by the budget proposals, a huge amount of research, and it's just too late to make the changes to taxes at this time in the fiscal year. The budget will come around for 2026, will come around quickly enough, and it'll be about that time when the states will be ready to make these key decisions.
Can I just come in with a supplementary response to your first answer?
Yep.
It sounds as if the rationale for the Green Paper and a debate on the Green Paper is principally as a communication exercise to the community and prospective candidates. In paraphrasing your response, that seemed to be the case. The Green Papers are traditionally there to allow a debate that will subsequently allow policy to be formed as a result of that debate. What changes, if any, do you see the paper and the debate performing that role, or is it, in other words, do you see there being changes following the debate in the policy formation, or is it really all about the former, the communication exercise, as you said in your first answer?
I think it's important to have the debate, otherwise we won't know. The only way of answering your question will be to have the debate. It's essential, in my view, that the debate takes place. But remember, it'll be the last debate of its type. We will give an update on the fiscal position for 2024 at our meeting in March. There'll be an opportunity to ask me, and regrettably only me, questions at that time. But the important thing is that we all go into this general election understanding with as much clarity as possible the issues that matter. Now, there are people on this table and indeed the SMC in front of me who understand these things in detail. I'm not sure every states member understands the matters with the clarity that they should. So this Green Paper discussion is a perfect example for that to happen.
Was the reason behind presenting this as a Green Paper to avoid amendments?
No, but I thought you might ask that question, and cynical members would. No, the purpose of this Green Paper is to ensure that as many people are as well informed about this crucial matter as possible.
But of course that could have happened even if it hadn't been presented as a Green Paper, if it had just been presented as an ordinary policy letter.
The states would have spent days debating a lot of amendments that wouldn't have been particularly valuable, whereas this debate will allow members to articulate their concerns, their views, their priorities, their values, in a way that will be fresh in everyone's mind in the lead up to the election. I think it's extremely valuable.
So I think those two answers say that it actually was about avoiding amendments then.
No, it wasn't. And if you're not prepared to accept the answers that I give, then I will be surprised at that. No, we're very clear This is an important exercise, and it's an exercise that people need to understand the place it takes in the economic and fiscal cycle, we're very happy that it does both.
Okay, Deputy Trott, in the States last week, you said that GST will have to go up beyond 5%. Is that the view of all members on policy and resources?
I think, I've obviously been a supporter of GST for a number of debates that we've had on it. And I think originally, actually, it was looked at as to whether it would be possible to bring it in at 8%. It was modelled originally on that, and I think it was recognised that that was a step too far at the time. But the major problem that we've got is that this might keep us in a stable position, but our reserves are depleting, and this will not actually give us back anything to replace those depleted reserves. So it's a challenge, but I mean, it could be complemented with other taxes. I mean, obviously, we brought income tax as a short-term measure. That was rejected out of hand, and consequently, if it comes down to GST or no GST, then we will have a difficulty in finding the sort of finances that the island needs to obviously sustain going forward. So, I mean, I think that's going to be a discussion very much for the next Assembly.
Okay.
It's not my view that GST at this stage should be increased above 5%, although I had in the past been a supporter of a reduction in income tax and a higher rate of GST and linked to corporation tax, the old 10-10-10 idea. We're past that stage now. I think, going back to your first question, because from my point of view, it certainly does affect that, there is, I think, a misconception that increasing revenues by multiple small measures across the board would somehow alleviate our current financial worries, and I think that's a mistake. I mean, for one thing, it would be death by 1,000 cuts, and most of the issues would be could not be resolved by putting in those things, and the State's Treasurer has already alluded to some of the work streams are already there. We would have had a debate over some of those things that are already in play. So it's better, I think, to focus on the fact that this community in Guernsey, this Assembly and the next Assembly will need to decide exactly what services are appropriate and how to fund them for this size of island.
Yes, certainly.
While we're talking about the subject of GST, 'cause it seems timely, could I just ask the committee what progress has been made to date since the states agreed it on the preparatory work to enable the timely introduction of GST? And are you confident the revenue can be delivered according to the original timetable?
I'll hand over to the State's Treasurer in a moment to elaborate on this, but I think our belief as a committee is that if the next Assembly continues to endorse GST, it's unlikely to become functional until the 1st of July 2027. So we think that it's slipped by 6 months, but we do not anticipate that it will slip further than that. Having said that, we are giving it the emphasis and the priority that the States has directed us to give it, as if all 5 members of the Policy and Resources Committee believed it was the right solution and had voted for it. So there is no doubt that I'm comfortable with the amount of emphasis and importance we've given it. But Beth Ann, would you like to elaborate on that for us, please?
So the committee's considered several papers on the matter and has approved funding in order to progress the programme. Resources are being recruited and project teams being established. In terms of the detailed planning, there's one key consideration that will need to come before the new states, which is whether GST is applicable to food or not. And it's such a critical decision that until that has taken place, some of the other elements of the project can't flow. And so that's why we think that actually the 1st of July 2027 is a more realistic date, because the new states will need to decide whether GST is applicable to food or whether it's zero rated.
put it into perspective, Coffee, it's about, Deputy Faircloth, it's about 1%. So if you want to raise the same amount of revenues, a 5% GST that taxes food is the equivalent of a 6% GST that doesn't.
I understand that point, but what you seem to be suggesting is that that fundamental decision, and it does sound like a fundamental one, won't be made until the next assembly. So therefore, just how much work can you do before before the States is looking for the endorsement of a new assembly who might have a wide range of views on GST, including the fact that we don't or shouldn't introduce it?
Well, I think Deputy Salisbury would like to comment on this, so we'll ask for her thoughts.
Well, I'll go back to, because I think we're in the middle of a set of questions asking what we thought about whether GST was going to go up. I mean, I didn't vote for it, but I do believe that if we want to replenish reserves, it will have to go up. If we don't want to replenish reserves, it won't have to go up now, and that's the difference. It will very much depend on whether we want to follow our fiscal rules or throw them completely out, because we've got various rules. We've said that we want to maintain our reserves, and we're already breaching that now. So, you know, it's one thing or other. You could, if it's not GST, something else will have to give, and that takes me back to why we're not raising revenues now. Well, the states decided to bring in a GST, which increases, you know, more of a burden on the taxpayer. And then on top of that, we had lots of deputies looking around saying, oh, we could raise some more money from people here and raise more money from people there. So it wasn't, if we'd done that, we've got to look at everything in the round. And I think that's one concern I have, little bits and pieces being added and not actually looking at the impact it's having on the public.
Okay, thank you.
It's worth mentioning that there is an extant resolution, as I understand it, of the Assembly that our resources must not fall below 315 million. I'm not exactly sure where the 350 million comes from. I think it's a percentage of our overall revenue cost.
It's where the reserves were when we had the last debate on the funding investment plan.
Okay, that would make sense. Now, had we have approved the temporary increase in income tax that we proposed, we would not have fallen below that figure. We are expected to breach it now as a consequence of the decisions of the Assembly.
Yes, and I would add to that, if I could, that yes, I personally was disappointed the 2% didn't make it. Before I sat on P&R, I was on Social Security, and I can confirm that we did look in the joint meetings at an 8% scenario initially, but of GST. Okay. So that I, like most of us, if not all of us, believe that it may well have to be a higher rate, but like Jonathan, I think that, and Heidi too, perhaps implicitly, I think if you were to have a higher rate, you should bring about significant reductions in other taxes and charges. I also think that perhaps a slight minority opinion here, but we are very supportive of the fundamental spending review. And
we'll
looking,
be coming on to that shortly.
I think when you think of the public out there who want more and more spent on services, micro debates on arts and sports, I think if that demand is there, and we're seeing debates now about retreating from paying for care, for example, in isolation, I would argue that if the public want these things to be funded, then you can't have the penny in the bun.
Do you want to carry on with question two?
I'd just like to finish this, these questions on GST. So we've obviously got a lot of ground to cover, and we are going to move on to the FSP, I think, and indeed talk about that funding gap. But just finally on the GST for now, what is the risk to the island if a majority of new deputies, and we've spoken about this coming back before a new assembly, what's the risk if a majority of new deputies are voted in on a platform of overturning GST?
The short answer to that important question is extremely high. We have got to raise more revenues. It is a fact, an incontrovertible fact. It's an inconvenient truth that many fail to appreciate, that we already spend less per capita on public services than any of our competitors. That's an unsustainable long-term position. And we must invest. Investment brings economic growth, as has been evidenced in other places. It's a well-understood economic fact. And we haven't been investing anywhere near enough. So the risks are material. Do I think those risks will manifest themselves? No, I don't. I think we've really given this a lot of discussion over the years, and I think the new Assembly will be sensible enough and wise enough to embrace these measures.
So what additional annual revenue income do you consider the states would need to have available routinely to be able to undertake all the necessary capital projects and remove the structural deficit within, let's say, the medium term, within the medium term, let's say 7 to 10 years, in addition to the GST proposals that have been approved?
Well, the structural deficit, as shown in the Green Paper, is approaching £60 million a year. That takes into account the existing revenue-raising issues. So I think the short answer is a figure approaching that. But in order to deliver on all of our priorities, as they are currently agreed by the Assembly, and also to replenish reserves, is that figure sufficient, Bethan? Is the eradication of the £60 million ongoing structural deficit sufficient?
So the 5% GST with the changes to income tax and social security contributions, along with the Pillar 2 revenues, and the previous decisions of the states, which are additional income from motoring and further additional income from corporates, which was assumed to come from the registry fees. If all of those decisions are implemented, then there would be sufficient revenue to fund 2% of GDP per annum as required under the fiscal rules.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's useful, thank you.
Can I just add one more thing there, because I don't want us to ignore health and the rising cost of health. And several papers have proven or have indicated the fact that by 2040 we will be at least £40 million worse off. So that's the kind of quantum
And
that
that's
we're
not
actually
obviously
looking at.
included in these calculations.
And I don't need to remind you, Deputy Burford, that sometimes, despite our good intentions, the states can not necessarily grasp the nettle of higher motoring charges. So I do wonder, although that's banked, how and when the states will actually find a solution to additional revenue from that source. But maybe we're going off topic there.
Yeah, I want to explore, if I may, a few more questions around the capital projects. Deputy Trott, you provided the good economic rationale that you need to invest in order to grow, and we've failed to invest. However, there are some things that within this list of capital projects which is simply investing because we need to replace stuff. And I'm really trying to understand which projects you think of this list are, what might be called productive capital expenditure. In other words, things that will increase the productive capacity of the economy, as opposed to simply needing to spend in order to replace stuff. Because there's a big distinction between the economic effect of the first and versus the latter.
It's a very good question. I mean, a good example would be Alderney Airport. It costs us about £400,000 per annum to repair Alderney Airport's runway. That's quite a consistent figure. It may increase marginally. I don't think it will increase enormously. However, it costs us £1.2 million each and every year to borrow the amount of capital necessary based on 24 million in order to fund a more extensive rebuild. So questions around what stokes economic activity and what is economically affordable are valid ones. I think the report, the Funding and Investment Plan, has a list of projects that the Assembly regards as essential. But clearly, the next phase of the hospital modernisation is crucial in an ageing community. I think there are a few of us who would disagree with that. And of course, we've got the ongoing funding envelope of the education plan to consider in this as well. Beyond that, clearly, any investment that we make into affordable housing is absolutely essential to our economy, whether that's in reducing costs or enabling, in particular, our major industry the opportunity to expand and employ the people that it needs on island to service our existing clients. Because what we're seeing is a migration of a lot of this activity to other centres simply because the industry is unable to find enough accommodation to house its key workers. So it is not only those key workers within industry, but also the cost of the key workers within the
thank you.
health
Well,
and
in that-
social care.
I mean, in giving that answer, you've perhaps illustrated the two examples of capital expenditure between those which may be classed as productive capital expenditure that's going to increase the economic capacity of the economy, such as having more housing, and therefore more people able to be here as opposed to leaving because they can't be here. That's one aspect. Versus, quite an expensive hospital extension, which arguably is not going to make a significant difference to our economic capacity. Which drives me to my next question, which is, in essence, the theme of the Green Paper is all of this stuff is needed. All of these projects need to be done. And it's really really a challenge as to why the committee wasn't more ruthless in determining what the order of priorities is, because they cannot all be of equal priority. They may all be needed, but they cannot be all be of equal priority.
States of deliberation believes they are, and it's an important point to make.
Okay, but do the committee believe it is?
Well, the committee is an organ of the Assembly, and that's not a cheap answer to a complicated question. I mean, clearly we have to cut our cloth accordingly, but I don't think there's anyone in this room who would disagree that in an ageing population you need to modernise your hospital. And the chronic housing shortage that we have is understood by, I think, just about everybody. Now, those are two priorities that can't be avoided. There are others that I would personally argue are less essential. But so far, the Assembly has disagreed with me. And I'm not going to be drawn on what I think they are personally, but I take your point that whilst they may all be priorities, some are absolutely urgent and essential. And the ones I've highlighted certainly fall into that category.
Okay.
And the states have debated it on more than one occasion and said that they want this list. I mean, the previous committee came and decided to take elements out, and the states said they want to put them back in. So there's no indication that anything will change if we would say, right, we'll take these out. Be pretty sure that wouldn't end up being the final result. I mean, we know, yes. The list that we've got here has gone through and been considered in great depth. And you say, well, we can't do them all at once. No, I've said you can't do it all at once because of the capacity. It's meant to be a portfolio over 5 years. That's now going to be extended anyway. And the longer that we don't do them, the worse our economy will be hit, either directly or indirectly. I mean, we've got the future harbour requirements. That could really help the island, the whole reinvigorate part of the island, and I would think could be an opportunity for growth. But we could spend hours and hours saying, well, we won't have this and we won't have that. But we've got this list now, and we've got to get on and do it.
Just really to answer your first question and your second question, which we didn't touch on, was the amount that productivity can be improved, either in the economy itself or certainly within government. Obviously, some of these projects actually will help to achieve that. Well, in theory. I mean, AI obviously is another thing that we don't know quite how that's going to impact, as it could be a blessing, it could be a curse, but we'll wait and see. But the other side of things, I think, is that the list that we've got actually moves because, say, for example, PFOS, which has actually gone up quite substantially, but we are now under pressure from the UK to get that sorted. And we've put it off as long as we could. But of course, that's the problem, that some of these actually bubble to the surface for reasons beyond, obviously, our control. And then you have to refocus and reprioritise. And that is unfortunate. With such a long list, it's inevitable that's actually what we're going to get. And we are seeing that already. But I take your point that obviously, and I think Deputy Trott's answer in terms of housing is clearly very key, because that could actually help a great deal if we can service it.
Good. Sorry, I'm going to move on. My next question actually just picks up on this question of capacity, and really what is realistically achievable, and really understanding what can actually be paid for by 2027. And isn't it actually more realistic to run this right through the entirety of the next assembly, right to 2029? Wouldn't that not be a better, more realistic approach to this portfolio?
Well, I think what we've said is you're going to have to extend the duration of this portfolio by at least a year, probably longer in reality, in order for it to be met. But it is all about capacity, and it's why we can no longer rely, as disappointing as it is to say, on indigenous supply within the construction industry. We need outside intervention, and Deputy Mori is better placed to talk about one of these issues, in particular the erection of a construction village that will facilitate that outcome.
Yes, absolutely. We put this into the original budget, and it was added to, if you recall, it was Deputy Taylor, where a further village for key workers, or however we want to define key workers, was added. But the construction village can pay for itself insofar as, obviously, if we are able then to unlock a lot more housing, or infrastructure build, however we want it, but it's primarily housing, I think, as we want to focus that. And the concept really is that it could come into play quite quickly, because we're talking about really the import of ready-made modular pods that people can actually live in for a period of time, transient workers. What they do require, obviously, is utilities to be available at whatever position that we put them in. We've already, and I think it's already in today's paper, there's, we put out on our sort of tender portal for a partner who can perhaps help us to manage that, both potentially in sourcing these pods, but also then in managing thereafter, obviously the occupancy and so forth. And that's not yet been, there is no programme at the moment determined as to what the priority would be as to who would have access, etc., etc. We're really trying at this point in time to move the dial forward as quickly as possible, because we do see it as a possible way to start to unlock some of the backlog that we've actually got.
Chair, are you happy to, because we did have some questions, you're happy to we actually did have some questions around the construction village, so if we might just diverge onto those for a moment. I'm just curious really to understand as you may have seen, Deputy Murray, in today's paper that you referred to it, that there is clear expressions of concern, which I would even articulate as opposition from the construction industry, as from spokespeople from the Guernsey Construction Forum and the Guernsey Building Trades Employers Association. That seems odd. If the purpose of this is to increase the capacity of the construction sector, that they do not appear to have been consulted with, they say, and do not appear to be firmly on board, and are expressing concerns about it. Could somebody comment on that?
I'll lead off. Deputy Murray understands the detail around this greater than I, but I'll give a high-level view, and it is this, and it won't endear me to many of my friends in the industry, but you'd expect them to say that, wouldn't you? You're talking about introducing significant amounts of competition, which is in the best long-term interests of this community as a whole, and therefore it is understandable and unsurprising that those with the most significant interests in this would seek to frustrate and delay this process. The Policy and Resources Committee has given it the priority it deserves, and that is why the procurement process has been accelerated, because I repeat, it is in the best long-term interests of this community that there is rapid intervention to alleviate this problem. You're an intelligent man, Deputy St-Pierre. You'd have come, I'm sure, to the same conclusions, but I welcome the question nonetheless. Now, some detail around it from Deputy Murray.
I don't think this has come as a surprise to anybody, because clearly this has been, publicised for quite a while. Obviously, what has now precipitated this is the fact that we've actually put it out to tender. And it's really just a very high-level tender at this point in time. We haven't been very specific other than actually indicated the areas that we're looking to get some help with. We've also put it into the UK, because obviously it is very likely that these will actually be imported from the UK, possibly from France, but from the UK. But I think we've heard the cry several times in various fora that obviously there is a lack of labour, which is obviously frustrating the industry. And this is a response to that. Now, there is a suggestion, I think, and it's just an assumption, that this will actually be something for maybe the states alone will actually manage. It is quite possible and more than likely that this will be available, if you like, for local builders and developers to be able to house as well. Yeah. Now, that's very early days as to how we could actually manage that, but there was no intention at this point to completely exclude local. I mean, we've done this several times before. I mean, the airport's a classic example when we brought in a lot of labour, when labour was actually available to us. When we had a particular project, obviously, to put aside, because the island certainly couldn't cope with it in those days. And we're in a very similar situation at the moment. We've got so much building and infrastructure work to do that we do need to import the labour. And the challenge has been, of course, that a lot of that labour isn't as easily available anymore post-Brexit. So, you know, all we can do is to try to make the facility available, and we will obviously build on what the opportunity is in terms of operation to that and access to that as we proceed.
You mentioned specifics, Deputy Murray. Have you been specific about a site or sites?
Only an outline at the moment, and there are two logical ones just now. One is at the Lock campus, or the Les Osway campus, because that has actually available space, and clearly that will be a major building project in its own right. The second one is potentially also off to the field to the side of the Coutonche campus, because once that is released, then the whole of the wrong opportunity there, which has actually been earmarked for housing for some considerable time, would obviously then be available to go forward. So that, again, would be quite a useful situation. Plus, both of those have got utility facility already and infrastructure on site. So, you know, that we could be up and running quite quickly from both of those sites.
And has there been consultation with anyone about those sites?
When you say anyone, who specifically?
The community?
No, I mean, we've been looking at, because these are not carved in stone. But, you know, from our perspective and looking at available, suitable sites, they would seem to be front runners. But again, until we actually understand the requirements of these pods that might be coming in, then, I mean, another area potentially, for example, could be the Duval site at the moment. If obviously the S5 goes through that we've actually asked for, which obviously at the moment the DPA seem very minded to do, because obviously that's going to be released. Again, there are facilities down there. It was originally for housing, even though this is a sort of 5-year plan. So there are areas that we can actually look at to do that. But at the moment, we had to try to specify something that might be within reach fairly quickly for us.
What timescale would you imagine if a construction village is erected that it would actually remain for?
Well, at this point in time, we're thinking for a 5-year term.
Right.
You know, once it becomes operational. But I mean, again, the future is a little bit difficult to prescribe.
And when is the TGI due for completion?
It's a 2-year programme, and that is expected, if everybody's agreeable to it, to start probably later this year, to be honest.
So if the Osway was a site, then the TGI in its operational phase and the construction village would coexist on that site?
Yes, it would. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, we've actually obviously earmarked that, and it's the same actually with the Coutonche. It's in a separate site altogether at the moment, so it's not interfering with the operation of the current Coutonche TGI.
I'd just like to pick up on something Deputy Trotz said in his original answer, if it's okay, because I think this is quite an important issue across a number of different projects, and that is the fact that you said, and I think you also mentioned this in the States, that the procurement process has been accelerated for this. How has it been accelerated? Because there are obviously a lot of views on procurement and how well it works. So how have you gone about accelerating the procurement process?
Well, I think it's important to say that we're lucky, we're fortunate, we've got a very professional procurement team. But my understanding is that it is at the top of the list in terms of the effort that the procurement team have given this project. So in other words, it would normally have had less resource and taken longer, but it's had more resource and been accelerated as a consequence of that. I think that's correct. I look to my colleagues, and the Vice President has some thoughts.
The local industry, we're talking about, well, they don't like the idea of this, but it's the local industry that have told us that they can't get accommodation for the people that they want to bring over. So we know we've got that issue anyway. So it is right we've accelerated, and it's strange that we're always hearing about complaints that the States take so long to do anything, and then when we try and do something fast, we get told off for that. But
in fact, it's important to emphasise a sensible question that was asked earlier from Deputy Saint-Pierre about these capital projects. I mean, a lot of the effort has to go into enabling works, whether that's the procurement and establishment of flood defences to enable places such as Veals Yard to become viable. It's things of this nature that have to be done, and that's why the priorities list is as long as it is, because they are, in some cases, interdependent. But I hope that answers your question on the procurement process. I mean, we mean business is the message here. This cannot go on with this stasis where we're building no more new homes than we have on trend over the last few years has got to stop, and we will do, whether it's the removal of GP11, which we were told was a big hindrance, or whether it's the introduction of additional capacity, we will do what it takes to alleviate this community of its housing crisis. Of that you can be assured.
I think the responses from Deputy Murray and Deputy Trott do slightly conflict, in that Deputy Trott said that the concern for the industry will be that it will increase competition, which for the local industry, which would suggest that this is a facility which is going to allow those from outside the island to come in and start and provide additional capacity as competitors to the local industry. And that may well be the concern in the context, of course, of the TGI project, which is contracted to a Jersey contractor. So you could understand the local industry seeing it as, well, this is just an additional bung of 5 million to enable that project to proceed at pace. Whilst Deputy Murray said, well, actually we need to respond to the request of the local industry, and actually this may be available to them. But you have indicated in your responses that the scope of who may occupy this village has not yet been fully locked down. And that, of course, sorry, let me finish.
Sure.
And that, of course, might include the direction from the states in relation to the availability for locals who don't have housing. Now, if that were the case, then, of course, it completely changes the nature of the project and its longevity and everything else. So actually, as ever, scoping the project at the beginning is a pretty important part of the process, and yet we're now tendering it without knowing exactly who's going to use it. Is that a fair summary?
No, I don't think that's really the case at all.
I didn't think you would.
No, I mean, the reality being, obviously, that, at some point, clearly, we will have a procedure for the occupancy. But I don't think it's beyond the bounds of anybody's, reason to assume that local contractors, local builders at the moment are already housed. So this is actually adding to the stock of housing that is available. And if there is an inability at the moment, and I mean, you mentioned obviously Rock, which is obviously, I think, a good example, because being on TEP, I'm very much aware that a lot of that subcontractor work has gone to local companies. Not all by any means, but Rock have set up a local company. They very much want to obviously do what they can. And I mean, you'll be aware, obviously, that Jersey at the moment is somewhat in the doldrums in terms of building at this point in time. So, if we can find places to get staff here under whatever auspices they are, whether it's, an independent developer or local builder, or whether it's a contractor coming in, the requirement is so great that I think we would be foolish not to try to make provision to try to enable that.
So would it also include the opportunity for established building firms over here to bring in additional tradespeople and house them?
I think that certainly is very much what it's been originally conceived to be able to do.
Okay,
I think the challenge, of course, is trying to find who gets the priority on something like that, which is why we're looking for a partner to manage both the construction of it and obviously the occupancy thereafter.
Okay.
We have received some mixed messages from the construction industry, but I don't think you've heard any mixed messages from the Policy and Resources Committee this morning on this issue. And the reason you haven't is we don't know which project will be accelerated first. We've got a pretty good idea, but we can't be certain. There's still a number of hurdles that need to be gone through. But what we do know is that we have had the occasional, I won't put it any more strongly than that, the occasional mixed message from the industry, and GP11 an example. We were told by people in the States and also who were active within the industry that the removal of GP11 would see an immediate response. Many months on, we've seen nothing to suggest that has come to fruition. So what we're saying here is it depends on who wins the tender, who gets to have access to this construction village, whether it's local or overseas. But the evidence would suggest that it's more likely to be capacity off-island rather than on-island. Now that's an uncomfortable truth, but somebody has to say it. and that's the message that we're giving. Everyone will be treated equally, which is what happens in a procurement process. However, the behaviours in recent, or the actions in recent years would suggest that additional capacity will drive some of these projects forward.
Okay, Deputy Fairclough, would you like to pick up on question 6? I think.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about procurement, and obviously there were some issues with the hospital modernisation project. Could I ask the committee whether the recommendations of the Thornton review have been fully implemented on all large-scale government capital projects?
Yes, indeed. One of the key outcomes from there was the introduction of a manual, which we've actually now created. It's online, it's a portal, so it's very readily accessible. It's been tested actually already, further testing this month, and then we expect this quarter it will be rolled out complete. A lot of other things obviously in that report, for example, how SROs are engaged and what the responsibilities are will be determined. All of that has actually been put into place at this point in time. We're also now embracing the NEC4 form of contract with construction personnel, because that clearly has got a lot more capability of being managed so that you don't get a fright at the end when obviously the costs catch up with you. So yeah, very much all of actually what has been suggested or was suggested has already been dealt with and is actually in place at this point in time. And that should, bearing in mind that obviously the outcome was not that actually governance was at fault, but actually to try to ensure that we didn't find ourselves in a similar situation again. There were some things that we could do to try to improve people's understanding of their roles and responsibilities, and that's actually been undertaken now.
So have there been structural changes to the way that projects are sort of set up and
One of the
managed?
things that we are unable to deal with, if you like, in the very short term is the shortage of project managers, because one of the suggestions in there was that rather than necessarily looking to a head of a department, when you might have a departmental project that you're dealing with, in time what we would like are people that can actually understand the construction process and obviously be much more au fait with what is required there to make sure that it is actually managed and audited all the way through. I mean, clearly, obviously, independent or areas of committees that actually have particular needs, once those needs have been described, it doesn't necessarily mean that a very senior person within that department is the best person to take forward a construction project. And I think that's been part of the challenge as well. Plus, of course, you will have a backfill situation if you actually are tying somebody up on a very large project like the OHM or indeed TEP. So I think that was a very good suggestion from them, but we don't at this point in time have enough project managers, and we've been talking about the extent of the infrastructure projects that we have in front of us. So we do need to build up that expertise in-house.
So can you confirm that the recommendations of the Thornton review and the SMC report on Agilitis have been applied to the electronic patient record system project, which is a live project, of course?
That has definitely been looked at in far more detail now as a consequence. I mean, it's a live project. In fact, possibly, I suspect, part of the rationale for having to put the costs up is actually a consequence of us actually having much more of a laser-like focus on what's now required in that. So I think you're already beginning to see, but unfortunately it does come at a price, because obviously the more that you spend in terms of audit, which is very right and proper to do, it prevents shocks, but at the same time there is a cost to putting that kind of resource behind something, but it's necessary to do it and to doing it.
So are you suggesting that extra, I think, 4 million off the top of my head?
I'm not saying that's all that, but the fact that we've been able to evidence that that's a requirement is part and parcel of the work that's been done to actually ensure that these projects are costed properly.
Mr. Degari, when he was the head of public service, attended a scrutiny committee meeting after the publication of the Thornton report, and we were assured that issues around the hospital modernisation capital project were isolated ones, and I think that was reflected in comments at the time. Are you confident that is the case?
On OHM2 particularly, or?
Yeah, that it was an isolated problem, that this wasn't something
Yes.
that was being repeated in
Yes.
other projects across the states.
I think the report said it wasn't systemic issues weren't the issue in that particular instance, but the report went on to show where things could be improved. And the irony is, we had the processes at the time were very thorough, and you could say a lot of stuff is done, but was it adding value? And I think what's arisen out of that and the creation of the project manuals enable people to focus on where the important points are, and to make sure you get value out of the process, not just do the process, just have the process for process's sake.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. 6 years ago, in 2019, we had the hospital modernisation policy letter. Those of you in the previous states will recall, and the phase 2, well, it was called 2 and 3 then, but it's essentially the same, was set to cost a total of £49 million. By 2023, that had risen to £120 million. Soon after, we learned that it was £150 million, and now I understand it has risen to £179 million and is having to be drastically scaled back, which is essentially not doing the part that was called originally phase 3. What is wrong with states' processes that a project can increase in cost by nearly 300% when inflation in that period has been less than 30%?
Well, I brought the original policy letter, so I can give some background as to how that figure came about. It was always the intention of that committee to have, and it says actually, I think in the policy letter that that the successor committee would come back to the states with phase 2, and it was just and 3 because it was 3 phases. And I think what went wrong here, and what added to the problem that and finding out in a very odd way that the numbers were completely out, was because it never went back to the States on phase 2. And I think if phase 2 had come, that the work would have been done properly and you'd understand what those differences were. But that first figure definitely was very indicative of the time, because we knew it was always going to be higher because it was going to happen in the future in the first place. And it was very much scoping, these are the sorts of things that we want in phase 2. Now that all changed, and we had phase 2 and 3 come together. And I remember at the scrutiny hearing that you had with Health at the time, and saying on the back of that, they needed to, if there was such a fundamental change in the project, it really should have come back to the States. So then we'd have been able to get a better understanding of what was going on.
It's hard to imagine a change so fundamental, given what was needed and the space available even, that we should have gone from 49 million, which is the cost for phase 2 and 3 combined. And I accept it was an early estimate, to 179 million. I mean, sure, there will have been things added in, possibly some things taken out, but the difference is just of such an order of magnitude that it really ought to, raise a lot of alarm bells. But
well, I can assure you from our committee's point of view, we have challenged the figures that have come, and I Deputy Mayor in particular is an area that he's really focused on, and we've questioned them. We ended up with getting a review done to see whether challenge and see whether things can be brought down. That's made a difference, but I think we do need to see are some of the elements in there absolutely necessary. Deputy St Pierre talking about, well, the hospital, would it add any extra to growth and the economy? And we probably have to think, do we need to have the breast unit there?
Well, that leads me very neatly into my next question, which was, have you as P&R considered commissioning an independent, and I think that is the key, an independent review of the necessity of all of phase 2 of the hospital modernisation project in the light of these runaway costs? And when I say phase 2, I'm actually still, because they change the numbers so often that it's, it looks as though it's almost designed to confuse. But when I say 2, I now mean what is now called 2A and 2B, so the remaining work.
Well, we had the review, the value engineering work that brought an independent voice to it, which did make people think, well, what is needed and what isn't, which resulted, I think, in 2A and 2B.
But did that look into the actual clinical needs with an independent eye, rather than being told what by perhaps local medical experts that is actually needed? So the independent review, I'm thinking, is less about the value engineering of how you build a construction project, and more about the actual sort of review on the actual real clinical need for everything that's being done.
Well, at the very beginning of the programme, that did happen. And an independent person was brought in, and I remember going through that process and saying, well, that's very nice to have, but do we need it? I don't know what has happened in the intervening period, whether that has been challenged.
Well, maybe things have been added in, which accounts for some of the cost increase.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, it's not something that that I've seen, but we are told that the fundamental elements in there don't look different. It might be just what is considered the size of something or how big something needs to be. But I haven't seen that.
I think, you go next.
Yeah, I don't want to dampen your day, but the issue is one of the things that we have been told by HSC is that whilst from a construction point of view, this is how they see it could be phased. What has not happened yet that we're aware of, but they're going through that process just now, it hasn't been passed through their clinical governance. Because obviously part of the reason that we've got what we have here to build is because obviously the focus has been on what clinical needs are perceived to be. So even though the cost has gone even further than we anticipated, hence the requirement to go to 2 phases on it, it has not been passed through their clinical governance yet to say, well, actually, you can cut that off or you can do that later. So one hopes it wouldn't get any worse than this at this point. But they also have to go back to the business case because part of the rationale before was obviously for the private wing to generate more income. But that has had to be curtailed to some extent in just to get this within the kind of budget that they require. So unfortunately, at the moment, till we see the new business case, we're not entirely sure what that might entirely look like in terms of its contribution to the overall costs. But the one big elephant in the room with this is that, you know, if we're going to require 100, 150 more staff to obviously maintain the larger premises, where are we going to put them? Because there's a cost attached to that as well.
Well, and presumably how are we going to pay for them?
And well, also how we pay for them. But, you know, we really need to be working along with that side by side. To some extent almost, you need to be building, if you're not going to do it simultaneously, you almost want to be building the accommodation in advance. Because at the moment, out of necessity, HSC has to place, you know, bodies all over the island, which essentially is preventing other industries from having that temporary accommodation available to them so they can grow. So it is kind of a chicken and egg, but it is a major problem. I do understand what you're saying on that. It's a worry that it's gone up to the extent that it has, and an even greater worry that went even beyond that once we got a separate set of consultants in who've perhaps arguably got even more experience in this area. But as to whether 2 phases broken as they are at the moment, we're too early to say whether that's the right decision or not.
If I could
I think it's a
personal view, I'd say obviously recruitment and retention, employment's important, but one of the bigger questions out there is actually the resilience of the hospital and actually the future, because I think Deputy Burrard has identified if we didn't go ahead with it, we'd find the costs would increase in other ways. And actually, an underlying question is how much medical services should be provided, universal service obligation, but also on island, and how much off island. I think we have a model where we try to do it on island. We could work more with Jersey, that's not always easy. But if you started to pare down on the future of the hospital, then we might need more planes to take patients elsewhere, and I'm not sure there's a public appetite for that.
Yes. So,
Deputy Salisbury's first response as to kind of where it went wrong was that it didn't come back to the States for approval of phase 2. Now, of course, that was as a direct result of the decision of the States on the recommendation of PNR at the beginning of this term to effectively delegate the management of the entire capital programme to PNR. So in light of the experience, which you've clearly identified as one of the reasons why it's got to the stage it has, will PNR be revising its view on the extent to which delegated authority ought to reside with PNR rather than have projects scrutinised by the States?
My point was more about the political judgment. I think knowing that the project was changing so much, and knowing and things were changing and where the costs were going, I think it would have been right to put it to the States in any event. I think it was okay if things are bobbing along nicely, but when there's clearly things are changing to a great extent, you want to know that you've got the Assembly behind you. And just to add, talking about the review that was done and the value engineering, that did actually look at the clinical needs and did complement the work that had originally been done to look at those needs in the first place. So it has actually been looked at from at that level, but Deputy Mary's made very clear the clinical governance work that still is needed for the state that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, so let me make a couple of observations. We've referred to the project manual. And if it's helpful for the Scrutiny Management Committee to see a demonstration of the project manual to understand what it looks like now and how the contents are set out and how it improves navigation and access to guidance, then I'd be very happy to arrange that for you. But the way that accountability is dealt with the senior responsible officers is a key part of this, so they understand exactly what parameters they're working in. And I don't think it matters whether that comes under the direct auspices of the Treasury and Resources Committee or elsewhere, as long as the expertise exists and the structures are appropriate to enable appropriate delivery. But what I will say about the cost of inflation is construction inflation has genuinely been running at a pace faster than normal retail inflation, and that has certainly been the case since COVID. It's normalising slowly, but slowly nonetheless. And there is this factor of optimism bias where human beings are genuinely more optimistic in what they believe something will cost early on that needs to be taken into account. And that's why we now have an optimism bias factored into our financial analysis of what a project will cost in order to address that particular factor. So there are a number of different issues. Can it happen again? As it happened in the first, it's much less likely to happen if the guidance within the project manual are adhered to. And that is where where political oversight is essential to make sure that process is undertaken.
Okay, thank you. I think we've just got one more question before we take a break. But on the optimism bias thing, I certainly recall that being included in capital projects in my first term, which takes us back 10 years. So I don't think it's anything new. And I think this project definitely fell within that timescale.
It's become more refined. It's certainly higher these days than it used to be. But I take that point. It's not a recent initiative.
In terms of cost savings, or potential cost savings, given that it's highly unlikely that the new sixth form centre will be built anytime soon, do you still consider it's worth spending what I believe is around £1 million to put the foundations in place?
I can answer that. That's not £1 million, it's 400,000 at
Okay.
this point in time. Well, at the moment, unfortunately, because the States has agreed to 2 phases, we have to run with that. That's what's been quoted. What I can say is that tomorrow we actually have the TEP programme reporting to us in our papers. I am aware that it's within budget. So, including obviously the 400,000 for the sixth form. But the other side of the coin, of course, is that we are aware that there is a time frame on the Martyr Carteret. And, the longer that goes on, the more we will spend on maintenance on a building that eventually is going to, be knocked down. So one has to look at the trade-offs between the two of them.
It was challenged.
Oh yes, it was definitely challenged.
And but I understand it's not going to be quite as people would understand foundations as being.
No.
And it will be far less. So we all decided to.
Go
It's
with
best to leave it.
Okay, we'll take a short break now. If people could please reconvene, let's say, before 11:10. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Deputy St Pierre.
Yeah, just a quick question, I think probably directed at the Vice President, if we may. So 4.5 years into the term, do you, I guess personally, but also the committee, still consider that the GWP is the correct model for the prioritisation of state's business, or do you see any changes being envisaged for the next term?
I'm happy to answer that. I think Deputy Murray is leading on that now, but I'm happy to start it off, and I know that my colleague will propose some very useful comment as well. I think we're definitely in a better place than we were at the beginning of the term. As you'll know very well, we had the last term a very large policy and resource plan which had everything in it, and anybody could justify doing anything because it was always in the policy and resource plan, and it didn't have any funding linked to it either. So the idea was to try and bring that together, and we started that off and managed to cull quite a few resolutions and hone it down. But that is a difficult process. It was never ever intention to be the final solution when it was first published. It is going to be, and has proven to be, and continue to be, an iterative process. And yes, I would say there's still far too much in that, and I think it's very difficult taking all committees, in particular, along that journey of understanding you don't have to fill in absolutely everything and get everything that you want in there to enable things to get done. And I think it's got much better as we've gone along, and we've had 3 pillars that make it more focused. But yeah, I think that there's still that need to be aware that you can't do everything. And I think we talked about optimism bias earlier. I think there's an optimism bias amongst committees that they can do these things and they want things done. But then you're juggling lots of different plates at the same time as doing the business as usual. So I think that it's further to go, and I think the next states will need to very soon come back to the Assembly with a revised plan, which me personally think needs to be thinned down quite a lot, and the funding honed down better. I don't think it needs to be completely got rid of and start again. I think that will take a long time. I know how the amount of work that needed to go in this time, and we did really try to get something to the Assembly really, really quickly, and we did within months, which is in states' terms better than what was taking over a year to produce. So I think from that point of view, it has worked. But it is not the finished article at all, but I'm pleased with the progress that has been made this term.
Thank you very much. Perhaps with the interest of time, looking forward, could you, Deputy Murray, just articulate your thoughts on how it may differ in the next term?
I think the lack of funding is going to have a huge effect on this, because clearly what we end up, part of the challenge that we have because of our committee system is that we're unable to prioritise. The priorities come up individually, and then the Assembly will make decisions individually, unfortunately. So when the GWP comes forward, and we obviously do all the due diligence that we can, whatever finance is available, whatever, but we can't insist on a priority. We can suggest. It's the Assembly ultimately, and I think the comment was made before that had we taken the proposed Green Paper forward, this is exactly what we would have had a bun fight, because individual committees have their own particular aspirations that they want to see through, and particularly the closer to the end of term, it starts to become even more acute. I think the challenge that we've got going forward is that we have to find a way to be able to prioritise, because otherwise the alternative is that you could end up with the lowest common denominator that everybody will agree on. That isn't necessarily good governance. But it's the way our committee system functions at this point in time. So I think we have to have a better idea of where we're going. And I think that's always been lacking, or it's been lacking for quite some time, what our objective is as an island and for government to be able to support that. And we don't have the fora to be able to explore that in any great detail. And so we are effectively, knee-jerking to the responses that come up from committees. And they're all very valid, in terms of their own mandates, they're all very valid. But I think to your earlier question, how do you prioritise then a list that's this long when there is so many people actually looking for support for the, and then you get into political arguments rather than necessarily what might be the practical realities of what we need to deal with. I mentioned before the OHM2 project. Clearly, there's a requirement for much of the facilities that they've required. But then if you start to add on the staffing issue, and it's a major problem in terms of the island context, that's not being dealt with. I mean, they're aware of it, but we're not actually being able to find any way to prioritise in what order that we do those things because our committee system doesn't make it possible. But we have a GWP, and we can only grow from it. But I think, as I said before, the limitation is going to be the lack of funds.
Thank you very much.
Deputy Chair.
I would add 2 points to that. I'm not a huge fan of all these plans, and I've been around, well, the state strategic plan, government business plan, all of these things. But they are useful, and it has improved matching the funding, and both Bob and Heidi have done magnificent work with it. But I would make 2 points. Lyndon, Deputy Trott, said it's important for the candidates and the islanders to know the big situation. And here's a figure, and yes, it's hard to understand, but one of our, and I could be corrected if I'm saying this wrong, but it's believed the next states, 2025 to 29, will have a maximum at the moment of 150 million to deliver its major projects portfolio, with investment demand likely to be more than 1 billion. Now that is a very, very interesting point, and it begs the question that we really do need 2 things, not only a framework of collective, and as Bob always reminds me, corporate behaviour, but probably, and I think this is a priority for the first year of the new term, to reshape our machinery of government, to actually get that work done, of which a lot was done this term, but it didn't quite make the cut.
Okay, thanks. Deputy Chair.
Sorry,
Yeah.
could I just add one thing,
Sorry.
because I think it's really important. Universal entitlement.
Yes.
And obviously what we've suggested in the Green Paper, if we can't get to a point whereby the states does only what the states can do, and whatever that costs, it costs, and we have to fund, then clearly we are going to carry on just adding either more bodies or certainly more cost. And we are at a point where, if going back to our very earliest questions about the GST, if something, either GST or something very, very similar to it, is not brought in, we will be in a far, far worse state than we currently are, as my colleague John has just suggested, because the infrastructure costs alone are enormous. And at the moment, we are struggling to say, well, we'll just cut that, we'll cut that, but at some point, that will come.
And in terms of, and on the subject of sort of meeting funding requirements, if the monies from the bond are utilised as planned, how will these funds be repaid? Have these repayments been included in your forecasts?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there is no one better to answer that than Beth and Haynes. So if I could ask her to.
Yes, so we have actually started using the bond monies now, that as agreed by the states. And so the funding and investment plan has allowed for, obviously, the interest that's payable on the bond, but a notional repayment of the capital as well, because, of course, the capital isn't repaid until the end of the bond period. But we have allowed in all of our modelling for the capital to be repaid as well. So it's not just going to be a big shock at the end of the term.
Okay, so that's been built into all your projections?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Whilst you sort of decide where to move next, I think what's come across from this discussion, importantly, is that there has been, by any international standards, a consistent underinvestment in our infrastructure over many years. It's not just the states, it's the one before, and indeed the one before that, that bears some responsibility, and it has to be addressed. And that is, whether we get to it or not, I know not, but it's one of the reasons. There are 3 or 4 why Jersey's economy has outperformed ours. And their much more significant investment in their economy at the public sector level, as well as the private sector level, is one of those factors. But I think it's been very useful discussion.
Yeah. Sorry, do you mind if I just pick up? I think there's a logical supplementary to that, which is around the provision in the fiscal framework for 2% of GDP to be spent on capital projects. And of course, that was only inserted by amendment. And the advice from officers at the time, after extensive research, was actually it was only 1.5 was really what was actually viable and deliverable. But that, of course, makes a 20 million difference to the structural deficit. So has PNR revised its view, or is it simply living within the direction of the states on that particular topic, whether irrespective of the advice?
First thing to say, and I'll ask the Vice President for some comments on this, but the first thing to say is that we have consistently underachieved on that 2% target. And as a consequence of that aggregate underachievement, you need to up your game, you need to raise it up in order to return to some level of equilibrium, some sort of long-term balance, if you like, in the way we spend on our infrastructure. So that's how I would initially address that question, but how would you answer?
Just to say, we tasked the Fiscal Policy Panel to come back, and we're expecting a report by the end of this month, I think, Bethan, to look at, and specifically to look at whether that percentage makes sense or not, because
So that's a general review of the fiscal framework, is it?
there is a general review that we are undertaking, but that
Okay,
bit's separated.
And just very quickly on the bond, I mean, obviously, this Assembly dispensed with the previous constraints about the use of the bond for projects with an income stream. Was that the right decision?
I think it's in the balance as to whether it was the right decision. I think it was the expedient decision at the time, but I would have preferred it if the outcome had been slightly different. I mean, it's all well and good to rely on inflation to inflate away the cost of this liability. And may I once again compliment you and your foresight in bringing this before the Assembly, which I recall I supported enthusiastically. Inflation has made a very big part in eroding away this debt. But there is still a capital cost at the end, and I think it's being extremely well managed by the Treasury team in its style and approach. But yeah, I mean, it has got to be repaid. We mustn't lose sight of that.
Thank you.
Having missed the boat earlier this term, in the policy letter you acknowledge that conditions are not favourable for borrowing at the present time. What happens if they don't become favourable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, at some stage we are going to have to bite the bullet. And it is, in fact, on Thursday night, I was at an event where the Governor of the Bank of England spoke about his very recent, or the Monetary Policies Committee, very, very recent decision that morning, in fact, to lower the base rate. And he said that the UK economy, the sterling zone, faces a number of headwinds, not least some difficult messages around inflation. But notwithstanding that, he believes that rates will continue to fall. It may take a little longer for it to fall, and therefore the borrowing environment for us as a jurisdiction will inevitably improve, but it may take a little longer. That may suit our position. But it's important to remember that at the start of this term, 4 years ago, there was an extant resolution that enabled the new Policy and Resources Committee to borrow. At that time, interest rates were at historic lows. That was, I mean, I'm not trying to rely on foresight here. You didn't have to be a genius to figure out that was exactly the right time to launch the second bund. The previous states was very comfortable with it. I suspect the new one was as well. But the Policy and Resources Committee of the day chose not to take advantage of that resolution. I personally think that was a mistake. And I suspect most observers would agree with me on that.
Okay. Given the uncertainty that's been expressed surrounding the United States' involvement in the OECD Pillar 2 arrangements, how confident are you that we can have any faith in seeing the anticipated £30 million annual income that we've been banking on, and that indeed provided the rationale for pressing ahead with the TGI?
Well, I think from the way I've been briefed, the issue is more to do with Pillar 1 than it is to do with Pillar 2. And the evidence suggests that Pillar 2 remains in line to produce the revenues that we are anticipating. So I think there's been some mismanagement around the data, around whether it's Pillar 1 or Pillar 2. I think it's Pillar 1 that is the issue, not 2. So I think I don't think it's a matter that we need to be particularly concerned about at this stage. you want to add to that?
Just to add that the Revenue Service team are doing some more investigation into that, but of course the US has a separate system, it's called GILTI, I believe, which is what everybody had assumed would be in place anyway. So they were never expected to participate in Pillar 2 in the way that we are.
Okay.
And so we don't think it's a
So
matter of
essentially you
concern.
remain confident of an income stream of £30 million per annum?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And bizarrely, if interest rates stay a little higher for longer, then we anticipate that number has the possibility to creep up rather than creep down. So it's ironic to interpret it in that way. But of course, it's one of the reasons why Jersey's economy has performed stronger. I make this point while I'm speaking, and that is that they have a larger banking sector, a larger deposit base, and their banks have taken full advantage of the margins that are available to them, and that has been reflected very positively in the numbers. The converse happens when interest rates start to fall, so it's important that we bear that in mind.
Okay, Deputy St Pierre.
Yes, I was just researching the latest US position on Pillar 2, actually. But given the US position that anything can change from hour to hour, there's probably not a great deal of merit in pursuing it. Fundamental.
We rely on executive advice on a matter as technical as this.
Yes.
Or Deputy St Pierre's, whichever suits.
Fundamental Services Review, FSR, find another 3 letters. Obviously, the policy letter refers to an intention to undertake that. Could we just speak a little bit more about who do we think will be doing that? Is it going to be internal or external or a mixture of the two?
Okay. Start off with Deputy Salisbury's contribution.
Yeah, well, we're currently bashing out how to structure that, and we will be bringing it to the States, so they will be able to decide whether they like the idea or not. So what we're doing now is our own internal considerations. So, yeah, I think there will need to be an element of external, but I'm hoping that with what I want is not what ended up with the very beginnings of the FTP, when I think committees didn't feel that they owned the process. And I think after that, things have changed, and we got more some concrete results from it. But it definitely has to be something that committees, the states are all part of. And also, actually, personally speaking, I think the community needs to be involved in this, because this is about what we as a government provide. And this is something that was important when we're on health. And this is an extension, really, of what we decided and considered at health last term with the universal offer. And the work that I'd hoped to have been seen by now. What is it that government should provide? What is it that it should commission out? What shouldn't it provide? What can be subsidised? Just that fundamental review of how things are done, and we do things the same way because we've always done them like that. And it's only by looking, as I've said before, thinking differently, that we can make real change. And I think that's the kind of the reasoning behind. We think it's not about looking at the numbers first and saying, well, how much money does that cost and cutting it. It's more about if we get the model right, the finances follow. So we're turning it around from that spending review to a services review.
So I take it that's not going to come to the States this term, however, is it?
No, the scoping of it will, and what we envisage will happen. So the terms of reference and the costings for it will come the States, because we need the next States to be up and.
Okay, so we will get a policy letter on the
Yes.
terms of reference for it. Thank you.
And in terms of the internal resource that will be required to support and service that project, I mean, presumably that will draw resources away from other priorities, going back to Deputy Murray's point earlier about the GWP, or do you envisage the need to recruit additional resources in order to undertake the FSR?
So that work is currently ongoing with, and Bowley will be very much part of that, sorting out how best we can do it. You will know that we agreed that a delivery unit and resourcing of that in the budget, and possibly some of the resources in the delivery and innovation unit will be used as part of this process. I'm hoping so. And again, it goes back to let's see how are we operating and supporting committees in making the changes.
I think it's an important point I'm going to make here now is that the review will help to define core government services which could be commissioned services and which should be funded through fees and charges, and services which should be stopped. And the reason I make that point now is that when we went out to the community last time, and I agree with my friend Deputy Le Top that they should be involved again, of course, what came back were a whole load of revenue-raising measures which trumped those where savings could be found. So what we're talking about here, I think Deputy Murray's point earlier, is whether some of these services should remain universal or not. In other words, should everyone get them, or should some people not get them because of their income levels? So once again, are we necessarily talking about cuts to services? No, I think we're probably talking more about how they're funded and by whom and when. And that's an important distinction to make. I don't want the community panicking that suddenly those who are the most vulnerable in our community will see a very inconsiderate states behave in an unpleasant way towards them. That's not what's intended. But it's important to remember the backdrop, and the backdrop is that we already spend less per capita on public services than our competitors. Yes, there's waste and inefficiency in an organ as big as the states of Guernsey. It employs 5,000 full-time equivalents, for instance, but it's not riddled with waste and inefficiency. All that number would be very much higher. We deliver public services, generally speaking, quite efficiently.
If I might add, it's also a fundamental services review, so
Yeah.
it is important that the community has an opportunity to understand that living on a rock, I often say this, but I'll say it again, we can't achieve everything that you would in a much larger jurisdiction. Also, we could do it in different ways. So there are some things that we could be doing, maybe even in addition to what we're currently doing, that people would want, but we would need to not just cut and paste from a larger jurisdiction, because the risks are different for us. So, for example, at the moment, I know that HSC are dealing with some backlog in operations by sending people to the UK for operations that would normally take place here in Guernsey. But in the future, we could potentially, that could be a commissioned service to some sort of private facility in Guernsey that would bring income and enable some of those things in addition to take place here in Guernsey. It needs to be a services review. It needs to look at the way in which we facilitate the services that this community wants.
Can I ask one more supplementary on this, which is Deputy Salisbury gave some of the lessons learned from the experiences of the FTP as a spending-driven process as opposed to a services-driven process, which I think is helpful. The question really, and it's probably actually better directed at the people sitting behind you than it is at the politicians, the experiences from the public sector reform process, which was primarily driven at the public services level rather than at a political level, and what lessons have been learnt from that process, which will feed into the into the FSR process.
Is it one that you, I could ask you just to give some thoughts to, Beth Ann, seeing as you are on the front table with us? But for me, the issue here is that there's no doubt that the costs of public services have increased, but they've increased primarily because of our requirement to look after our elderly and sick, and we are experiencing a genuine demographic push in that regard. So when we look at the public sector worker numbers, I mean, there are hundreds of additional nurses and care workers. Now, I don't hear the community telling me and our committee that there are too many nurses and care workers, but that is where the thrust, the drive in the cost of the public service has primarily, from a staff level, been, and the costs associated with that, whether it's finding appropriate housing for them or simply encouraging them to come and work here, have been considerable. Beth Ann, the public service review, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that myself and colleagues have got considerable experience now of multiple different approaches to reviewing the services and the spending of the states. So the fundamental spending review, the FTP, public service reform, priority-based budgeting, all sorts of different reviews. And what we're trying to ensure is that the proposals that we're putting forward to advise the committee take into consideration the lessons learnt from all of those. But one of the key learnings is that it has to be a priority and it has to be properly resourced. And if we continue to do everything else that we've always done and try and do this as well, then it will fail.
Dr. Fairclough.
Guernsey is subscale for just about everything. And an illustration of that is that ordinarily you need a population of about 250,000 to sustain a hospital. We're 26% of that. But people don't expect 26% of the services coming from a hospital. So we have to find more creative ways, and I think the partnership of purpose, the clue is in the name. We're going to have to get into much greater partnerships because the level of demand and the range of demand, we don't have that economy of scale and never will have. So we have to be more creative. And I mean, without a doubt, that is one of the major drivers, as Deputy Truss has just said, of the increase in the public sector. It's actually been to support health.
Just got a couple of questions on the revenue service, and states members still receiving emails from members of the community with various tales of woe of their interaction with revenue service or income tax. There's a theme in these emails of people having to interact with numerous staff before receiving a satisfactory resolution. In the States last week, Deputy Trott, you informed us that the service was fully staffed. Clearly, if a person has to interact with many staff, that's highly inefficient. Is this an issue of which you are aware, and if so, what's being done to resolve it?
No, I'm fully aware. Deputy Fairclough will remember that I also talked about a change in the way in which IT was being delivered to updating a 30-year-old sort of legacy system to ensure a proper risk assessment so the right people are assessed quickly and efficiently. No, I'm genuinely of the view from the information that we've seen as a committee that the Revenue Service has turned a corner. I made that point in the States and I believed it and I meant it. But you'll remember that I also apologised on behalf of the committee and the service for the challenges that it's faced. Staff retention has been an issue. Recruitment has been an issue, but we've turned that corner too, from what I understand. It's a direct report to Beth Ann, and I think we can look across the table and ask her to confirm or deny the comments I've made. But I personally genuinely believe that where we've seen the worst and things should improve and improve speedily. Would that be your view, Beth Ann?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
you mentioned the IT aspect, and could you just tell us exactly where you are with regard to the upgrade of the Revenue Services IT systems? Because we know from previous statements that the programme's been delayed by several years and has required additional money to move to completion. Is that upgrade now completed?
I believe they're no longer deploying the legacy systems. I think they're reliant on the new system. Whether it is fully implemented or not, I'm just going to see. Is it fully implemented?
There's the last bit of implementation to be done.
Thank you. It's almost there, but not quite, and that's why we anticipate things would improve and improve significantly, because it's almost there as we
It's
decide.
also, we've had the data transition that took place in earlier this month,
At the end of last year.
end of last year, and everything was pushed forward. But the only issue that we found on that was around, but because we trying to minimise the amount of changes to the system, so we weren't ending up with disparities between the two. It meant that there was a halt on certain elements in relation to repayments, and the team were trying to get as many repayments as they could before that some were outstanding, and so those people had their repayments delayed by until about the 20th, I think, until they could so that could go on. But I think for such a massive system, and this isn't just income tax, this is social security as well, the fact that things didn't, I mean, it'd been on the front page of the press if it had all gone wrong, and it didn't. And so I think that there's a lot of credit to the team that managed that. But absolutely, the system, you know, it is absolutely reliant on getting that system up and running and improving the processes. So it's not just about getting the IT in, but that the IT will enable the processes to be improved.
In one sentence, it's substantially complete. It has experienced its normal implementation challenges, but they have been dealt with.
Okay,
There'll be a
given the churn
post-implementation
in the staffing that you've expressed that's existed, presumably that means that a lot of the staff are inexperienced in the way the actual systems and everything work. Is there an adequate training and support programme in place for staff to come up to speed quickly?
I think that one I would pass it back.
That's been part of the transformation programme to ensure that, you know, that actually the new systems are more intuitive and easier to use than the old systems, but of course staff need there's a significant training programme because of the, you know, the intricacies of the income tax law.
Because I do think that does really seem to the point that Deputy Fairclough made, that really seems to be the biggest issue that comes through to me in people that we have contacting us, is that they speak and they explain their entire problem, which is usually lengthy, to one member of staff who then at the end says, oh, well, I can't really do anything, I'll get so-and-so to call you, and then this thing goes on. So it does seem to be, which obviously is using up a lot of resource where those people could be doing something that they were comfortable with. So that's just an observation from what comes through to us as States members.
So I think it's a fair observation. I mean, the problems we face is that the very businesses that are responsible for providing professional services to their clients are often the people who offer packages to our staff that are more attractive to them in the private sector than we're able to offer in the public sector. Now that's not to move away from the fact that the service is now focused on ensuring that the improved technology that we've got substantially implemented is used to drive operational improvements and benefits to customers. So it's well aware it has fallen short in certain areas, but it sees a much rosier future.
Can I just add though that on that, but we've had in the weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks up to the tax deadline, 3 times as many calls. I think we had 1,900 calls over the last few days. And in those circumstances, it would have been all hands on deck. We were trying to get people to be able to answer those calls, and it quite possibly there were people that wouldn't be able to answer some of those calls. And I think, yeah, it's a fair comment, but just to give that position.
Thousands of people left it to the last sort of 72 hours to submit their return of income form. Regrettably, I did not lead by example. I was one of them, for which I apologise, but it is a fact that even those of us that lead busy lives did leave it to the last minute. But so did thousands and thousands of other citizens. You were going to have that crunch point. It was inevitable.
The business case for the new system, of course, was built partly on or on the redesign of revenue service and bringing the two parts of income contributions and taxation together was, of course, a smaller headcount. Has that been delivered or not?
No, please.
That was always intended to be delivered after the systems are implemented. Yeah. So now is the critical time over the next year for bedding in those systems and delivering the benefits.
But you are still anticipating a reduction on headcount?
That's still in the plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was one of the late ones as well, queuing up the stairs, but I was impressed to see an officer from the Revenue Service marshalling us and organising it so that it went well. And I went to a drop-in of a tax, and I discovered anecdotally that there are less tax assessors than before, because as the point has already been made, the private sector is a very competitive employer for many of our workers. So I think that should be considered, that it, far from being a fat public sector and the revenue service, the opposite is rather true.
Go with question 20, please, Deputy Fairclough.
I'd just like to move on to the subject of Agilicis, which, as you know, has been the subject of a Scrutiny Management Committee review. In your media release following the publication of the Scrutiny report, you said the review's recommendations align with activity already completed or ongoing. However, the SMC notes that you have no immediate plans to appoint an IT advisory board. Do you believe you have the relevant expertise in-house to make key decisions on future technology options?
Bob? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of the other recommendations we had either implemented or are implementing at this point in time. On that particular one, I think it's a little early because of all the changes that we are making at this point in time. I think you can get to a position where too many cooks in the kitchen by having advice being taken from too many sources at this stage. We've got a lot to actually stabilise, and make our system robust. And we've worked on that, and it is far, far better than it was, obviously, in the sort of 2-year time frame that the report covers. But at this stage, I mean, it's only a year or so since we actually employed Gilles Drossart behind me in that central role as sort of digital supremo. And he really needs to be able to get through this, a little bit longer to be able to establish what other additional help he might need. But for example, one of the things that we've done very, very quickly and that he recognised straight away was that lack of resource. Because if you'll recall, one of the key findings that you guys actually had was, 6 individuals, however they got to that point that they were described as being sufficient, was way, way, way below what we needed. And we're now up to a complement of about 20 in there. I think we have 1 or 2 vacancies still. And I think your own report suggested 25 would be a more suitable number, obviously, to be managing that. So we're at that point where we're still, if you like, developing and becoming more robust than we've been. At some stage, we can get back to that requirement, because I think that's more industry involvement, at some stage, because we've got a key role, I think, as government, to be able to bring IT and AI is perhaps another area of it, to be able to bring that forward for Guernsey. And if we can get it right, then I think obviously industry can follow and rely on. But what will happen, I'm quite sure, is that if we develop that expertise in-house, as we were talking about the revenue service, it will probably be going out the door again, because obviously skilled individuals, which obviously government spends a lot of time in developing, are very much prized by the private sector.
Yeah, you refer to the recommendation on the need for substantial additional investment. How much more money do you believe will need to be spent annually on additional revenue and in capital over the next 5 years to improve IT systems moving forward? And is that money available? Has it been earmarked?
Yes, there is some money that's been earmarked at the moment, but if I may say, there is a change occurring between CapEx and OpEx, because moving to the cloud actually requires you to actually buy seats, essentially, to put it more simplistically, as opposed to investing in kit which you then run on premises as is required. And we're seeing that with MyGov. So we've revisited MyGov, and what we're looking at the moment is probably around about a £5 million CapEx expenditure to put in place the platform that we require and the partner that we require. But it actually starts moving more towards about 1.3 million add-on to OpEx, because obviously it is largely a cloud-based solution. So the nature of the IT system is actually going to change, and the investment will probably change as a consequence. And one final thing that I would say that is really important to grasp is, hitherto, and I think one of the reasons that we've always been challenged with IT, is that we've tried to customize whatever source that we actually were taking on, whatever application it was, and some of them were very heavily changed and customized. And that was one of the prime reasons, unfortunately, that because they weren't sufficiently documented many years ago, that we weren't entirely sure, and Agilicis wasn't entirely sure. In fact, I don't think any of the tendering companies were, of the state of our legacy system. Now, what we have now decided and what we've recognised, and certainly through G's involvement, is that we actually have to adapt our processes to what the technology is providing, because the technology is always evolving. And rather than us actually trying to heavily customise it and make it very personal to what we need, I think we have to adapt to what the world is doing And actually that way we can always rely on, that the technology is up to speed and is as secure as possible. And the security is really, really key, because the more you customise, the more the likelihood is that you leave a trapdoor open somewhere unconsciously. And we cannot have our systems go down as a consequence of an attack. So cybersecurity is probably going to be quite a large part of what we invest in the future.
Yeah, and I appreciate you're on a journey, and it's probably a never-ending journey in terms of IT strategy and development. But you've stated that a new IT strategy will be published shortly. When will that happen?
Well, we do have the digital strategy that we actually have at this point in time, and we're in the process of actually promoting that within the organisation just now. But it's already available. We've talked to industry. We've explained to them what we're doing in that regard. Again, very much something that G has actually introduced. And there are various component parts, and there's about 7 pillars that we actually have in there. And we're working our way through all of those. But again, I think if government is a robust IT provider, then I think industry can rely on that, because our interaction with industry is also going to be very much driven by IT.
Can I make a very quick comment, and that's to thank the SMC for the professional manner in which you handled this scrutiny into the Agilicis contract, and for the mature way in which you engaged with us. It was, in my view, it was the states under our current system of government working at its best. So well done to you.
Deputy St Pierre.
Yeah, just focusing on growth. We've spoken a little bit. You've already referenced Jersey growing faster than Guernsey. That's been reported recently. The challenges around revenue and services, of course, would be an awful lot easier if we had a lot more growth feeding through to our revenues. So really, just a quick view on the role of growth in solving our financial issues, and what government should be doing about it, what you are doing about it, how that interacts with the role of the Committee for Economic Development. Is it fit for purpose in terms of that economic development challenge, or not? So it's quite a wide-ranging question, but again, just in the interest of time, if you keep it relatively tight.
I'll address it by returning to the issue of the day, and that is the issue of Moneyval. As I know you know, Deputy St Pierre, 40% of our economy, of our domestic economy, is driven by our financial services. It would have been a very bleak picture had we have been put on a grey list. I never felt that we would find ourselves on a grey list, but there's no question that our economy would have contracted had it have found itself on a grey list for the duration of the time we were on it. We're not on it, so the future is positive. But if we are to replicate levels of Jersey growth, we've got to get that infrastructure investment right. And it's got to be material. I mean, we're not reinventing the wheel here. All of the international advisors come to the same conclusions, whether it's our own fiscal panel or those who are employed in the supranational entities. Clearly, productivity is important. I'm one who falls into the category of having personal business interests, and I think we're less productive when we're working from home than when we're working at the office, but the international data suggests otherwise. I find that a contrarian to my thinking, but I think we've got to get all of these things right. I don't think we need to worry too much about tax. We are still on the OECD measure a very low tax jurisdiction. We are a very low tax jurisdiction, even after the proposed rises in income. We won't look in any way out of place as a low tax jurisdiction. In fact, there will be very material differences between us and our nearest geographical neighbours, Jersey excluded. So I think personally, I think the future is bright. I think that our growth rates will improve, but I think that investment is absolutely paramount. Investment is more important than the percentage that we tax our community. That's a fact. But we cannot go on with these levels of tax take. It's insufficient.
Can I just add to that? We're talking about productivity, participation in work, and that's something the committee has it's completed this stage 1 on looking at what the reasons for why people are not participating in work, what are the barriers. We've engaged with various committees, including economic development, of course, education, sport and culture, ESS, and externally, I think. And stage 1. It's been interesting, the findings from that. It will be published as part of the government work plan end of term report, so people can see the reasons for people not participating, what barriers there are. Some things won't be a surprise, and areas where, people will say, well, why do we need external people to do that? We knew it, but in other areas it's been very interesting. I think we thought this, the original reason why we're doing this is because of potential amendment Deputy Kazantova Miller and myself were looking at laying to try and to have this looked at, because we thought that there was definitely an issue here, particularly when it came to the preschool, childminding, nursery stage, for people being able to get back into work, the cost of it, the availability. And the research that we did at that time showed it was a wider problem. It wasn't just about that access, it was the issues that industry was facing. And on the back of that, we've had the stage 1 work that's done. There will be more work, and we'll get more data coming out of the secondary pensions project, because that will get more data on part-time working as well. So that stage 1's been done, and stage 2 will be coming online later.
And to follow on from that, you asked how we work with EDC. The answer is we work well with them. They kept us, for instance, fully updated with regards the contract on the ferry, which was important for a number of reasons. I don't think their budget's big enough. I would like them to have more, personally. I think it's important that they seed fund some of these initiatives that are marginal at best due to our economies of scale, but the funds simply aren't available for that to happen. But the overall picture is that we work positively with them.
Just have one more thing, because there's one area I think that we're overlooking, that's the cost of energy. Because the cost of energy is has a massive impact on all economies ultimately, and clearly it's only going in one direction at the moment, except perhaps in the US, who obviously have one of the world's major oil and gas exporters now through shale. I'm not entirely sure that actually the UK is ever going to actually go down that particular route. But growth is actually underpinned by energy costs and energy availability. It really, really is. And unfortunately, I mean, we've been shielded to some extent with what's happened in, throughout most of the rest of the world in Europe because of our contractual relationship that we had with EDF. That won't stay at the same level. That is actually going to obviously, we did extremely well, and that was, foresight was fantastic to be able to do that. But we're already in the negotiations there, and they won't negotiate on the same level that we had, well, not even just the price, but actually the same arrangement.
And on that point, it's hoped and believed that the wind farm states report will come before the Assembly this term. We're very much hoping. And for the next decade, if we play it right, it's extremely positive for both our revenues and for our long-term growth. But there's lots of ifs and buts in that, but it's certainly a bright spot on the horizon for us to take some comfort from.
Okay, thank you. I have two more questions before we can allow you to attend your lunch date, Deputy Trott. In the budget, there was a recommendation for an innovation and delivery unit. Does the establishment of such a body indicate that we have not been focused on either innovation or delivery in the past sufficiently? And what progress have you made on this?
I think what it shows is just how chronically under-resourced we actually are. I think the general belief is that we're full of people with their feet on the desk swigging tea, and that's simply not the truth. That's not the reality. And the innovation and delivery unit is I think, an excellent initiative. It was very pleasing that the states supported it so enthusiastically, because it will enable us to have a fast reaction squad, if you like, a group of people who can be deployed swiftly to help drive key initiatives forward. I'm conscious of the fact that the new chief executive hasn't commented yet.
This might be the ideal
I think it's
question.
a perfect opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think in brief, sort of going to the sort of government work plan, which I think is a good document. There's a strong emphasis there on, I guess, capital expenditure and affordability. There's maybe less of a correlation to resources, which often, from my early sort of review, seems to be at the crux of why things take longer than they should otherwise or might do. The organisation as a whole is full of good ideas. You know, it is a workforce that is very much up for change and up for doing things differently. And I've been inundated with ideas from people over the last months. So some support in helping turn those ideas into reality is a very, very sensible investment.
Okay, thank you. So one more question, which will probably come under the heading of "and finally." The valet bathing pools are used by thousands of locals and visitors alike each year.
You're not going to dive into that, are you?
I certainly am. The redevelopment of the cafe and changing rooms has been an outstanding success, but the pools leak badly. The ladies and gents pool lose around a quarter of the water between tides, and the children's pool is empty for 4 or 5 days each fortnight over neap tides. As a result of the diving board issue, many offers of assistance have already come in from our community. Will P&R use their delegated authority to match fund public contributions pound for pound in order to finally finish the restoration of these much-loved historic pools?
Well, if only we didn't have a deficit. I mean, I'll remind you that last year our revenue deficit was around £20 million. We think we have a chance of breaking even or thereabouts this year in terms of a revenue figure, but we still will have this structural deficit. I think we'd love to match this funding, but I think it's unrealistic to expect us to do it anytime soon. But what I will promise is that I will make a personal donation that will help the cause. And it's important to remember that the Policy and Resources Committee was not involved at any time during this process. It was an independent statutory official, and my understanding is that those committees that were involved with that have got together and addressed the community's concerns to their I think, commendation.
Can I just say, though, it depends on the figure. And one thing that we did do this time around in the budget is treat routine capital different. We've renamed it what was minor capital to routine capital. And also, instead of previously allocating all of the routine capital to various different elements, we put, I think it's 25 million as a separate sum within that to deal with unforeseen events or things that might be spent more in one area than another. I don't know, it will be, of course, for environment infrastructure to come back and say this is what the work that we leave needs to be done, and this is what we're planning to do. We can look at it, but it might be potentially something from routine capital, but we have to wait and see what the details are.
That's a much more encouraging answer, Deputy Soulsby, but I think that, as I understand, Environment and Infrastructure have no specific budget for the pools, even though the maintenance falls under their remit. And I think they have asked P&R over the course of this term about this. But anyway...
Well, it's certainly not from this...
Right, but
committee,
Deputy Trott, you'd like the final word.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much for having us. I gave a personal opinion just before, not a committee one. But the harsh realities of our financial position mustn't be forgotten. I think we should celebrate the fantastic Moneyval evaluation that we've announced this morning, or the industry has announced this morning. It's absolutely superb. And I think if we get our fiscal position right, I think the future for Guernsey is very bright. And I think this morning's SMC hearing has helped highlight that. Thank you very much for having us.
Well, thank you very much, and I would thank all the witnesses for attending so that we've improved the public understanding of the work that the committee and the states do. Thank you to everyone who's come along to listen and to all of those on the live stream. And the hearing is now closed. Thank you.